Little Shepherd of Kingdom Come by John Fox Jr. Chapter 22, Morgan's Men. Boots and saddles at daybreak. Over the border in Dixie, two vedettes in gray trot briskly from out a leafy woodland side by side and looking with keen eyes right and left. One erect, boyish, bronze, the other slouching, bearded, huge. The boy, Daniel Dean. The man, Rebel Jerry Dillon, one of the giant twins. 50 yards behind them emerges a single picket. After him come three more vedettes, the same distance apart. 50 yards behind the last rides the advance, a guard of 25 picked men. No commission among Morgan's men was more eagerly sought than a place on that guard of hourly risk and honor. Behind it trot still three more vedettes at intervals of 100 yards, and just that interval behind the last of these ride Morgan's men, the flower of Kentucky's youth. In columns of fours, Colonel Hunt's regiment in advance, the colors borne by Renfro, the silent, in a brilliant zouave jacket studded with buttons of red coral. In the rear rumble two Parrott guns, affectionately christened the Bullpups. Skirting the next woodland ran a crossroad. Down one way gallops Dan, and down the other lumbers Rebel Jerry, each 200 yards apart. A cry rings from vedette to vedette behind them and back to the guard. Two horsemen spur from the advance and take the places of the last two vedettes, while the vedettes in front take and keep the original formation until the column passes that crossroad. When Dean and Dillon gallop up to their old places in the extreme front again. Far in front and on both flanks are scouting parties miles away. This was the way Morgan marched. Yankees ahead, not many to be sure, no more numerous than 2 or 3 to 1. So back fall the vedettes and forward charges that advance guard like a thunderbolt, not troubling the column behind. Wild yells, a clattering of hoofs, the crack of pistol shots, and a wild flight, a merry chase, a few riderless horses gathered in from the fleeing Yankees, and the incident is over. 10 miles more, and many hostile bayonets gleam ahead. A serious fight, this perhaps, so back drops the advance, this time as a reserve. Up gallops the column into single rank and dismounts while the flank companies, deploying as skirmishers, cover the whole front, one man out of each set of fours, and the corporals holding the horses in the rear. The bullpups bark, and the rebel yell rings as the line, the files 2 yards apart, a long flexible line curving forward at each extremity, slips forward at a half run. This time the Yankees charge. From every point of that curving line pours a merciless fire, and the charging men in blue recoil all but one. War is full of grim humor. On comes one lone Yankee, hatless, red-headed, pulling on his reins with might and main, his horse beyond control, and not one of the enemies shoot as he sweeps helplessly into their line. A huge rebel grabs his bridle rein. "I don't know whether to kill you now," he says with pretended ferocity, "or wait till the fight is over." "For God's sake, don't kill me at all," shouts the Yankee. "I'm a dissipated character and not prepared to die." Shots from the right flank and rear, and the line is thrown about like a rope. But the main body of the Yankees is to the left. "Left face, double quick," is the ringing order, and by magic the line concentrates in a solid phalanx and sweeps forward. This was the way that Morgan fought. And thus, marching and fighting, he went his triumphant way into the land of the enemy, without sabers, without artillery, without even the bullpups, sometimes fighting infantry, cavalry, artillery with only muzzle-loading rifles, pistols, and shotguns, scattering home guards like turkeys, destroying railroads and bridges, taking towns and burning government stores, and encompassed usually with forces treble his own. This was what Morgan did on a raid, was what he had done, what he was starting out now to do again. Darkness threatens, and the column halts to bivouac for the night on the very spot where, nearly a year before, Morgan's men first joined Johnston's army, which, like a great, lean, hungry hawk, guarded the southern border. Daniel Dean was a war-worn veteran now. He could ride 20 hours out of the 24. He could sleep in his saddle or anywhere but on picket duty, and there was no trick of the trade in camp or on the march that was not at his finger's end. Fire first. Nobody had a match. The leaves were wet and the twigs soggy, but by some magic, a tiny spark glows under some shadowy figure, bites at the twigs, snaps at the branches, and wraps a log in flames. Water next. A tin cup rattles in a bucket, and another shadowy figure steals off into the darkness with an instinct as unerring as the skill of a water witch with a willow wand. The Yankees chose open fields for camps, but your rebel took to the woods. Each man and his chum picked a tree for a home, hung up canteens and spread blankets at the foot of it. Supper, heavens, what luck, fresh beef. One man broils it on coals, pinning pieces of fat to it to make gravy. Another roasted on a forked stick, for Morgan carried no cooking utensils on a raid. Here, one man made up bread in an oilcloth, and every Morgan's man had one soon after they were issued to the Federals. Another worked up cornmeal into dough in the scooped-out half of a pumpkin. One baked bread on a flat rock, another on a board, while a third had twisted his dough round his ramrod. If it were springtime, a fourth might be fitting his into a corn shuck to roast in ashes. All this Dan Dean could do. The roaring fire thickens the gloom of the woods where the lonely pickets stand. Pipes are out now. An oracle outlines the general campaign of the war as it will be and as it should have been. A long-winded innocent braggart tells of his personal prowess that day. A little group is guying the new recruit. A wag shaves a bearded comrade on one side of his face, pockets his razor, and refuses to shave the other side. A poet with a bandaged eye and hair like a wind-blown haystack recites, "I am dying, Egypt dying." And then a pure, clear tenor voice starts through the forest aisles, and there is sudden silence. Every man knows that voice and loves the boy who owns it. Little Tom Morgan, Dan's brother in arms, the general's 17-year-old brother. And there he stands leaning against a tree, full in the light of the fire, a handsome, gallant figure, a song like a seraph's pouring from his lips. One bearded soldier is gazing at him with curious intenseness, and when the song ceases, lies down with a suddenly troubled face. He has seen the death look in the boy's eyes, that prophetic death look in which he has unshaken faith. The night deepens. Figures roll up in blankets. Quiet comes, and Dan lies wide awake and deep in memories, and looking back on those early helpless days of the war with a tolerant smile. He was a war-worn veteran now, but how vividly he could recall that first night in the camp of a big army, in the very woods where he now lay, dusk settling over the Green River country, which Morgan's men grew to love so well. A mockingbird singing a farewell song from the top of a stunted oak to the dead summer and the dying day, Morgan, seated on a cracker box in front of his tent, contemplatively chewing one end of his mustache. Lieutenant Hunt, swinging from his horse, smiling grimly. It would make a horse laugh, a Yankee cavalry horse, anyhow, to see this army. Hunt had been over the camp that first afternoon on a personal tour of investigation. There were not 1,000 Springfield and Enfield rifles at that time in Johnston's army. Half the soldiers were armed with shotguns and squirrel rifle, and the greater part of the other half with flintlock muskets. But nearly every man, thinking he was in for a rough and tumble fight, had a bowie knife and a revolver swung to his belt. Those Arkansas and Texas fellows have got knives that would make a Malay's blood run cold. Well, they'll do to hew firewood and cut meat, laughed Morgan. The troops were not only badly armed. On this tour, Hunt had seen men making blankets of pieces of old carpet lined on one side with a piece of cotton cloth. Men wearing oxhide buskins or complicated wrapping of rags for shoes. Orderly sergeants making out reports on shingles. Surgeon using a twisted handkerchief instead of a tourniquet. There was a total lack of medicine in the camp. Diseases were already breaking out. Measles, typhoid fever, pneumonia, bowel troubles, each fatal, it seemed, in time of war. General Johnston has asked Richmond for a stand of 30,000 arms, Morgan had mused, and Hunt looked up inquiringly. Mr. Davis can only spare 1,000. That's lucky, said Hunt grimly. And then the military organization of that army, so characteristic of the Southerner. An officer who wanted to be more than a colonel and couldn't be a brigadier, who would have a legion, a hybrid unit between a regiment and a brigade. Sometimes there was a regiment whose roll call was more than 2,000 men, so popular was its colonel. Companies would often refuse to designate themselves by letter, but by the thrilling titles that they had given themselves. How Morgan and Hunt had laughed over the Yellow Jackets, the Dead Shots, the Earthquakes, Desperados, and the Hell Roarers. Regiments would bear the names of their comrades, a singular instance of the Southerners' passion for individuality, as a man, a company, a regiment, or a brigade. There was little or no discipline, as the word is understood among the military elect, and with no army that the world has ever seen. Richard Hunt always claimed was there so little need of it. For Southern soldiers, he argued, were from the start obedient, zealous, and tolerably patient, from good sense and a strong sense of duty. They were born fighters. A spirit of emulation induced them to learn the drill. Pride and patriotism kept them true and patient to the last, but they could not be made by punishment or the fear of it into machines. They read their chances of success not in opposing numbers, but in the character and reputation of their commanders, who in turn believed as a rule that the unthinking automaton formed by routine and punishment could no more stand before the high-strung young soldier with brains and good blood and some practice and knowledge of warfare than a tree could resist a stroke of lightning. So that with Southern soldiers, discipline came to mean the pride of which made soldiers learn their duties rather than incur disgrace. The subordination that came from self-respect and respect for the man whom they thought worthy to command them. Boots and saddles again at daybreak. By noon, the column reached Green River over the Kentucky line, where Morgan, even on his way down to join Johnston, had begun the operations which were to make him famous. No picket duty that infantry could do as well for Morgan's cavalry. He wanted it kept out on the front or the flanks of an army and as close as possible upon the enemy. Right away, there had been thrilling times for Dan. in the Green River country, setting out at dark, chasing countrymen in federal pay or sympathy, prowling all night around and among the pickets and outposts, entrapping the unwary, taking a position on the line of retreat at daybreak, and turning leisurely back to camp with prisoners and information. How memories thronged. At this very turn of the road, Dan remembered, they had their first brush with the enemy. No plan of battle had been adopted other than to hide on both sides of the road and send their horses to the rear. "I think we ought to charge 'em," said Georgie Forbes, Chad's old enemy. Dan saw that his lip trembled, and a moment later Georgie, muttering something, disappeared. The Yankees had come on, and discovering them, halted. Morgan himself stepped out in the road and shot the officer riding at the head of the column. His men fell back without returning the fire, deployed, and opened up. Dan recognized the very tree behind which he'd stood, and again he could almost hear Richard Hunt chuckling from behind another close by. "We would be in bad shape," said Richard Hunt, as the bullets whistled high overhead, "if we were in the tops of these trees instead of behind them." There had been no maneuvering, no command given among the Confederates. Each man fought his own fight. In 10 minutes, a horse holder ran up from the rear, breathless, and announced that the Yankees were flanking. Every man withdrew straight away after his own fashion and in his own time. One man was wounded and several were shot through the clothes. "That was like a camp meeting or an election row," laughed Morgan when they were in camp. "Or an affair between Austrian and Italian outposts," said Hunt. A chuckle rose behind them. A lame colonel was limping past. "I got your courier," he said. "I sent no courier," said Morgan. "It was Forbes who wanted to charge him," said Dan. Again the colonel chuckled. "The Yankees ran when you did," he said, and limped chuckling away. But it was great fun. Those moonlit nights, burning bridges and chasing home guards who would flee 15 or 20 miles sometimes to rally. Here was a little town through which Dan and Richard Hunt had marched with 9 prisoners in a column taken by them alone, and a captured United States flag flying in front, scaring Confederate sympathizers and straggling soldiers, as Hunt reported, horribly. Dan chuckled at the memory, for the prisoners were quartered with different messes, and that night several bottles of sparkling Catawba happened by some mystery to be on hand. The prisoners were told that this was regularly issued by their commissaries, and thereupon they plead with tears to be received into the Confederate ranks. This kind of service was valuable training for Morgan's later work. Slight as it was, it soon brought him 30 old condemned artillery horses. Dan smiled now at the memory of those ancient chargers, which were turned over to Morgan to be nursed until they would bear a mount. And by it gained him a colonelcy and 3 companies superbly mounted and equipped, which, as Morgan's squadron became known far and near. Then real service began. In January, the right wing of Johnston's Hungry Hawk had been broken in the Cumberland Mountains. Early in February, Johnston had withdrawn it from Kentucky before Buell's host, with its beak always to the foe. By the middle of the month, Grant had won the western border states to the Union with the capture of Fort Donelson. In April, the sun of Shiloh rose and set on the failure of the first Confederate aggressive campaign at the west. And in that fight, Dan saw his first real battle, and Captain Hunt was wounded. In May, Buell had pushed the Confederate lines south and east toward Chattanooga. To retain a hold on the Mississippi Valley, the Confederates must make another push for Kentucky, and it was this great southern need that soon put John Morgan's name on the lips of every rebel and Yankee in the Middle South. In June, Provost marshals were appointed in every county in Kentucky. The dogs were turned loose on the local success sympathizers throughout the state, and Jerome Connors, overseer, began to render sly service to the Union cause. For it was in June that Morgan paid his first memorable little visit to the Bluegrass, and Daniel Dean wrote his brother Harry the short tale of the raid. "We left Dixie with 900 men," the letter ran, "and got back in 24 days with 1,200. Traveled over 1,000 miles, captured 17 towns, destroyed all government supplies and arms in them, scattered 1,500 home guards, and paroled 1,200 regular troops. Lost of the original 900 in killed, wounded, and missing about 90 men. How's that? We kept 20,000 men busy guarding government posts or chasing us, and we're going back off. Oh, Harry, I am glad that you are with Grant." But Harry was not with Grant, not now. While Morgan was marching up from Dixie to help Kirby Smith in the last great effort that the Confederacy was about to make to win Kentucky, down from the Yellow River marched the 4th Ohio Cavalry to go into camp at Lexington, and with it marched Chadwick Buford and Harry Dean, who, too, were veterans now, who, too, were going home. Both lads wore a second lieutenant's empty shoulder straps, which both yet meant to fill with bars. But Chad's promotion had not come as swiftly as Harry had predicted. The captain, whose displeasure he had incurred, prevented that. It had come in time, however, and with one leap he had landed after Shiloh at Harry's side. In the beginning, young Dean had wanted to go to the Army of the Potomac, as did Chad, but one quiet word from the taciturn colonel with the stubby reddish-brown beard and the perpetual black cigar kept both where they were. "Though," said Grant to Chad as his eye ran over beautiful Dixie from tip of nose to tip of tail and came back to Chad, slightly twinkling, "I've a great notion to put you in the infantry just to get hold of that horse." So it was no queer turn of fate that had soon sent both the lads to help hold Zollicoffer at Chamberlain Gap, that stopped them at Camp Dick Robinson to join forces with Wolford's cavalry, and brought Chad face to face with an old friend. Wolford's cavalry was gathered from the mountains and the hills, and when some scouts came in that afternoon, Chad, to his great joy, saw mounted on a gaunt sorrel none other than his old schoolmaster, Caleb Hazel, who, after shaking hands with both Harry and Chad, pointed silently at a great strange figure following him on a splendid horse some 50 yards behind. The man wore a slouch hat, tow linen breeches, homemade suspenders, a belt with 2 pistols, and on his naked heels were 2 huge Texan spurs. Harry broke into a laugh, and Chad's puzzled face cleared when the man grinned. It was Yankee Jake Dillon, one of the giant twins. Chad looked at him curiously. That blow on the head that his brother Rebel Jerry had given him had wrought a miracle. His lips no longer hung apart, but were set firmly, and the eye was almost keen. The face was still rather stupid, but not foolish. And it was still kind. Chad knew that somewhere in the Confederate lines, Rebel Jerry was looking for Jake, and Yankee Jake doubtless was now looking for Jerry. And he began to think that it might be well for Jerry if neither was ever found. Dawes Dillon, so he learned from Caleb Hazel and Jake, was already making his name a watchword of terror along the border of Virginia and Tennessee, and was prowling like a wolf now and then along the edge of the Bluegrass. Old Joel Turner had died of his wound. Rube had gone off to the war, and Mother Turner and Melissa were left at home alone. "Dawes fit first on one side and then on t'other," said Jake, and then he smiled in a way that Chad understood. And since you was down there last, Dawes don't seem to hanker much at her meddling with the Turners, though two women did have to run over into Virginia once in a while. Melissy added was a going to marry Dave Hilton, so folks said, and he reckoned they'd already hitched most likely. Since Chad there, a flash from Chad's eyes stopped him, and Chad, seeing Harry's puzzled face, turned away. He was glad that Melissa was going to marry. Yes, he was glad, and how he did pray that she might be happy. Fighting Zollicoffer only a few days later, Chad and Harry had their baptism of fire and strange battle orders they heard that made them smile even in the thick of the fight. Huddle up there. Scatter out now. Form a line of fight. Wait till you see the shine of their eyes. I see 'em, shouted a private, and bang went his gun. That was the way the fight opened. Chad saw Harry's eyes blazing like stars from his pale face, which looked pained and half sick. And Chad understood the lads were fighting their own people, and there was no help for it. A voice bellowed from the rear, and a man in a red cap loomed in the smoke mist ahead. Now, get up and get, boys. That was the order for the charge, and the blue line went forward. Chad never forgot that first battle when he saw it a few hours later strewn with dead and wounded. The dead lying as they dropped in every conceivable position, features stark, limbs rigid, one man with a half-smoked cigar on his breast, the faces of so many beardless, some frowning, some as if asleep and dreaming, and the wounded, some talking pitifully, some in delirium, some courteous, patient, anxious to save trouble, others morose, sullen, stolid, independent. Never forgot it. Even the terrible night after Shiloh, when he searched heaps of wounded and slain for Caleb Hazel, who lay all through the night wounded almost to death. Later, the 4th Ohio followed Johnston as he gave way before Buell, and many times did they skirmish and fight with ubiquitous Morgan's men. Several times Harry and Dan sent each other messages to say that each was still unhurt, and both were in constant horror of some day coming face to face. Once, indeed, Harry, chasing a rebel and firing at him, saw him lurch in his saddle, and Chad, coming up, found the lad on the ground crying over a canteen which the rebel had dropped. It was marked with the initials DD. The strap was cut by the bullet that Harry had fired. And not for a week of agonizing torture did Harry learned that the canteen, though Dan's, had been carried that day by another man. It was on these scouts and skirmishes that the four, Harry and Chad, Caleb, Hazel, and Yankee Jake Dillon, whose dog-like devotion to Chad soon became a regimental joke. It was on these scouts and skirmishes that the four, Harry and Chad, and Caleb, Hazel, and Yankee Jake Dillon, whose dog-like devotion to Chad soon became a regimental joke, became known not only among their own men, but among their enemies as the shrewdest and most daring scouts in the Federal service. Every Morgan's man came to know the name of Chad Buford, but it was not until Shiloh that Chad got his shoulder straps, leading a charge under the very eye of General Grant. After Shiloh, the 4th Ohio went back to its old quarters across the river, and no sooner were Chad and Harry there than Kentucky was put under the Department of the Ohio. And so it was also no queer turn of fate that now they were on their way to new headquarters in Lexington. Straight along the turnpike that ran between the Dean and the Buford farms, the 4th Ohio went in a cloud of thick dust that rose and settled like a gray choking mist on the seared fields. Side by side rode Harry and Chad, and neither spoke when on the left the white columns of the Dean house came into view, and on the right the red brick of Chad's old home showed through the dusty leaves. Not even when both saw on the Dean porch the figures of two women who, standing motionless, were looking at them. Harry's shoulders drooped, and he stared stonily ahead, while Chad turned his head quickly. The front door and shutters of the Buford house were closed, and there were few signs of life about the place. Only at the gate was the slouching figure of Jerome Connors, the overseer, who, waving his hat at the column, recognized Chad as he rode by and spoke to him, Chad thought with a covert sneer. Farther ahead and on the farthest boundary of the Buford farm was a federal fort, now deserted, and the beautiful woodland that had once stood in perfect beauty around it was sadly ravaged and nearly gone, as was the Dean woodland across the road. It was plain that some people were paying the Yankee piper for the death dance in which a mighty nation was shaking its feet. On they went past the old college, down the Broadway, wheeling at 2nd Street, Harry going on with the regiment to camp on the other edge of town, Chad reporting with his colonel at General Ward's headquarters, a columned brick house on one corner of the college campus, and straight across from the Hunt home, where he had first danced with Margaret Dean. That night the two lay on the edge of the Ashland woods, looking up at the stars, the ripened bluegrass, a yellow moonlit sea around them, and the woods dark and still behind them. Both smoked and were silent, but each knew that to the other his thoughts were known, for both had been on the same errand that day, and the miserable tale of the last 10 months both had learned. Trouble had soon begun for the ones who were dear to them when both left for the war. At once, General Anderson had promised immunity from arrest to every peaceable citizen in the state. But at once the shiftless, the prowling, the lawless gathered to the home guards for self-protection, to mask deviltry, and to wreak vengeance for private wrongs. At once mischief began. Along the Ohio, men with Southern sympathies were clapped into prison. Citizens who had joined the Confederates were pronounced guilty of treason, and Breckinridge was expelled from the Senate as a traitor. Morgan's great raid in June '61 spread consternation through the land, and straightway every district and county were at the mercy of a petty local provost. No man of Southern sympathies could stand for office. Courts in session were broken up with the bayonet. Civil authority was overthrown. Destruction of property, indemnity assessments on innocent men, arrests, imprisonment, and murder became a daily occurrence. Ministers were jailed, and lately prisons had even been prepared for disloyal women. Major Buford, forced to stay at home on account of his rheumatism and the serious illness of Miss Lucy, had been sent to prison once and was now under arrest again. General Dean, old as he was, had escaped and had gone to Virginia to fight with Lee. And Margaret and Mrs. Dean, with a few servants, were out on the farm alone. But neither spoke of the worst that both feared was yet to come, and taps sounded soft and dear on the night air. End of chapter 22.